Well, quite a reading that we have coming from the sacred text today, of course, from the Gospels within the Christian tradition. But there is in this text a lot for us to consider, especially in light of the war and the violence and the death that we see in our world today. So I want to share now, just to ground us, some context of this text, to ground us tonight as we consider this theme of survival pending revolution, and how community care and projects of survival are powerful acts of resistance to empire. So let's start first with John the Baptist, often portrayed as a kind of a kooky guy who ate weird food and didn't comb his hair. But what we know about John the Baptist, and we can see from this passage, is that he was much more than that. He was a prophet, he was a revolutionary of his own time, and he had a following of people that was organized enough to be considered a threat to the local rulers. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived at the same time as John the Baptist and Jesus, described John the Baptist as a prophet who called for practices of justice toward one another and piety toward God. We have parallels of this text that we read today from Mark in both Matthew and Luke. And in Matthew's telling of the same story of this beheading, it says that Herod wanted to kill John the Baptist, but he was afraid to do so because of the crowd, because of John the Baptist's followers. And in Luke's gospel, it says that John the Baptist's criticism of Herod was just one of the many things, not the only one, that caused Herod to imprison John. These are similar statements to what we hear during Jesus's trial and crucifixion, for they both were revolutionaries, challenging the authorities of the Roman Empire and those who served at their pleasure, like the Herodian family. So the Herodian family, we know, ruled the Palestinian area from 40 BC to 100 AD, so throughout the time of Jesus's life and ministry and before and after. They were designated the rulers of that area by the Roman Empire, by the Senate and other leaders. And this is the same family that ordered all male Jewish babies to be murdered in Herod's attempt to kill the baby Jesus, which caused Mary and Joseph and Jesus to become refugees as they fled to Egypt. This family ruled at the pleasure and under the direction of the Roman Empire, carrying out their practices of violence and oppression during this occupation. And the ministries and preaching of both John the Baptist and Jesus were a threat to that power of the Herodian family. So turning then to our text for today, we have this scene where Herod, who's clearly confused about who John the Baptist is and what had happened to him, ultimately had him arrested and imprisoned for, among other things, criticizing his marriage. This criticism from John the Baptist isn't so much a criticism on moral terms, as is often portrayed, but really is more likely a political criticism of Herod's attempt to continue expanding and consolidating his and his family's power. At the same time, the historian Josephus tells us that Herod also imprisoned at the same time many of John the Baptist's followers. So the gospel accounts talk about John the Baptist's imprisonment. Josephus gives us a bit larger picture there that many of his followers were imprisoned at the same time. So clearly their criticisms were more than about just marrying who married who. And instead they were challenging Herod's very power, and were doing so as a well-organized grassroots group of the poor and dispossessed living under the occupation of the Roman Empire. So during the time of John's imprisonment then, Herod throws this large banquet. And some biblical translations tell us that the attendees of this banquet were high officials and military commanders. So in other words, these are members of the political elite. And in front of these political elites, Herod makes this promise to his daughter, and his daughter, at the urging of her mother, asks for John the Baptist's head on a platter. So we need to remember here, of course, that the Herodian family was a family of great political and military power. And so while the text says that Herod was greatly distressed, we know from other gospel texts that his distress was not because he really liked John the Baptist that much, but because he feared him and his followers, because they were. So in other words, this is a story of a social movement leader, John the Baptist, standing up to empire in the midst of violence and war and occupation and poverty and hunger. And the story reminds us that Jesus was not the only one executed by the Roman authorities. Far from it, we know. But in fact, many leaders, many revolutionaries in the Bible, in history, and today have stood up to the powers of empire, even in the face of death. But this is not just a story about violence and oppression of empire, and especially to those who would dare to stand up against it. But what we have here is another powerful verse, so short that we might forget it. But it's a verse that can and should provide us with hope and power as we navigate our own death-dealing society and ruling empires. And it's a verse about survival pending revolution, and about how for thousands of years and continuing to today, the oppressed care for one another as an act of resistance to empire. The last verse in our passage that Adam read for us says that when John's followers heard about his beheading, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Matthew's gospel here adds that they also went and told Jesus about what had happened. This act is not to be overlooked because we know from the gospel stories, as they talk about in preparation for Jesus's death, we know from writings of historians at the time of Jesus and John, and from the work of biblical scholars today, that the poor and the dispossessed and the occupied under Roman rule had developed rituals of remembrance and burial for their leaders. While Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't go into a lot of detail here, we just have this one verse. We can surmise, based on what we know about the rituals surrounding the death of the poor at the time, that there was likely a meal of remembrance and a proper burial, because this was how the poor and dispossessed cared for themselves and for their leaders in the time of war and violence and grief. Biblical scholar Hal Taussig calls these meals, which Christians practice today through communion or the Eucharist, meals of resistance to Roman imperial power, as were the burial rituals that accompanied them. Those who were too poor to die, and especially those who were crucified, beheaded, or otherwise executed in ways that were reserved for revolutionaries, their bodies were often not recovered or given the proper burial and the proper religious burial. And yet we read here that John's followers were not going to let that happen. And that is why Matthew and Mark and Luke included this short but powerful verse about how they came to care for the body of John the Baptist. As our own Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris describes in her book, Always With Us, this preparation for burial began to have a, quote, anti-imperial and revolutionary significance. Throughout the Roman Empire, she writes, there existed all kinds of institutions that were organized around various cultic figures such as Roman gods or goddesses, or labor associations, or other aspects of communal life. And one of the key functions of those associations was ensuring the burial and the memorializing of their members, almost taking on, she writes, the role of mutual aid societies for those too poor to provide for their own burial. When individuals died, members of their association would ensure that they were buried, honored, and remembered. And this act was a markedly anti-Roman and anti-imperial act of resistance, a practice of survival and care pending revolution. And these acts of survival strategies and community care continue today through a long lineage of leaders from thousands of years ago in Palestine, as well as many other communities of struggle throughout history and various faith traditions. And so today we have the chance to hear from two amazing leaders who exemplify these struggles today as we reflect on survival pending revolution in our current context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the struggles of the poor and dispossessed in the US, struggling to survive in this country in which poverty is the fourth leading cause of death.